Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a dismal November morning, the sort which renders London grey, not merely in colour, but in spirit, that I found Sherlock Holmes seated by the fire in a state of listless abstraction. The rain tapped in a rhythmic melancholy upon the windows of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, while a dense fog, yellowed by coal smoke, clung to the glass as though reluctant to release its hold upon the city. Holmes had scarcely spoken since breakfast, his long, lean form stretched upon the settee, his eyes closed and his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The silence, save for the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the floorboards, bore down upon us like a physical weight. "I fear, Watson," he murmured at length, "that London has taken it upon herself to grow tediously respectable. Not a single telegram of interest, no theft of note, no scandal. Even the criminal class appears to have taken leave." I offered some mild reassurance that the fog would surely drive some nefarious soul to error before day's end, but he waved me off with a languid flick of the hand. Just as I reached for the morning paper once more, a knock at the door broke the monotony. "Ah," Holmes said, without opening his eyes. "Unless I am mistaken, we are about to be visited by someone in rather urgent distress. Do you deduce that from the knock?" "No, my dear fellow," he said, rising with sudden energy. "From the unmistakable tremor of a silk hem against wet cobblestone, Mrs. Hudson's visitor is a lady, and she comes in haste." The door swung open and Mrs. Hudson, with her customary composure, announced, "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes." She stepped aside to reveal a woman of singular grace and marked agitation. She was tall, elegantly dressed in a dark green travelling coat with gloves still damp from the morning rain. Her face, pale and drawn, bore the unmistakable signs of recent sorrow, eyes reddened yet resolute, lips pressed into a line that spoke of both mourning and purpose. She clutched a folded envelope in one gloved hand. "I am Lady Eleanor Blackmore," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "Mr. Holmes, I have come to you because I believe my husband has been murdered." Holmes, who had risen with a faint bow, gestured to the armchair nearest the fire. "Pray compose yourself, Lady Blackmore. You have my full attention." She seated herself stiffly, then unfolded the envelope, revealing not correspondence, but a hand-drawn sketch of a room. At its centre was a shattered mirror. "My husband, Sir Reginald, was found dead 2 nights ago in his study at Wolfhurst Manor. The constable declared it suicide. He was found slumped beside a broken Venetian mirror, with a shard clutched in his hand. The window was latched from within. There was no sign of struggle." "And yet," Holmes prompted. "And yet," she continued, "Reginald would never have taken his own life. He was proud, driven, perhaps even vain, but not despairing. Moreover—" She hesitated, then leaned forward. "That mirror, it was not simply broken, it had been moved." Moved! It was a rare piece, 16th century Venetian. He prized it above all others in his collection. But 3 days prior to his death, he had it taken down and stored. When I entered the study, it was there again, shattered, and I believe he left a message in the shard he held." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. Lady Blackmore, tell me everything. Lady Blackmore reached into her satchel and produced a folded sheet of vellum. Upon it was an ink drawing, skillfully rendered, of a room I would later come to know intimately. A study adorned with antiquities, its focal point a grand mirror now reduced to jagged remnants. "This is how I found the room," she said. "Reginald lay here." Her finger hovered above a faint outline of a figure slumped beside the shattered glass. The constable said he had thrown himself forward in despair, that he struck the mirror in his fall. But I found that hard to believe. Holmes studied the sketch intently. The shard he held, was it unusually shaped? "Yes," she replied. "Triangular with a curved base. There was something etched upon it, or perhaps scratched. I could not make it out clearly." "A message, perhaps," Holmes mused. It would not be the first time a dying man made use of whatever medium lay closest at hand, though, of course, such gestures are as often misleading as they are revelatory. "Indeed," I added, "I recall the unfortunate case of the German secretary and the cipher in chalk." Lady Blackmore nodded, though it was clear she did not fully follow our reference. "I had the shard sent with the coroner's party," she continued. "But when I inquired after it, I was told it had been mislaid." "Mislaid?" She uttered the word with incredulous disdain, as though it were a scrap of broken china. Holmes's expression darkened with interest. "And no other signs of intrusion? No unlocked windows or displaced furniture?" "None. The windows were latched from within. There was no evidence of forced entry. And yet," Holmes echoed, rising and pacing before the hearth. "A man dies beside a mirror he had days earlier removed from its place of honour, grasping a shard that may or may not contain a final utterance. A locked room, a missing clue, and a widow who refuses to accept the official narrative." He stopped abruptly and turned to her. "Lady Blackmore, when do you return to Wolfhurst?" "This evening. The estate must be attended to." "Then Dr. Watson and I shall accompany you. I have no faith in mislaid evidence, and less still in hastily drawn conclusions." Our preparations were swift, for Holmes detested delay where mystery was concerned. By early evening, we were aboard the northbound express, the whistle of the locomotive echoing our own anticipation as we rattled toward Yorkshire. During the journey, Lady Eleanor spoke more freely of her late husband. Sir Reginald Blackmore, she explained, was a man of exacting tastes and singular passions. Chief among them was the acquisition of rare mirrors, Venetian, Ottoman, French, and occasionally those of more obscure provenance. He believed mirrors, properly curated, could serve not only as reflections of the present, but windows into the past. "He said they held memory," she said, gazing from the carriage window. "Not merely light." I saw Holmes lift an eyebrow at this, though he said nothing. He had once confided to me that collectors of antiquities were often as eccentric as the relics they cherished. "It was the Venetian piece that troubled him most," she went on. "He purchased it at an auction in Milan 6 months ago, paid a shocking sum, but once it arrived at Wolfhurst, he grew tense, distracted. He began avoiding the study, then had the mirror removed altogether." "And who was entrusted with its removal?" Holmes asked. "Our butler, Mr. Giles. He has been with the household for over a decade." "And did he say why he wished it moved?" "No," she replied. "Only that it no longer suited the room. But I found the phrasing peculiar. Reginald adored that mirror. To banish it without cause, something had changed." Holmes leaned back, fingers once more steepled. It is not uncommon for men to sense a malevolence in the inanimate, though the cause more often lies within themselves. The countryside slipped past in streaks of grey and green. As dusk settled over the moors, I could not help but feel that we were travelling not merely northward, but into some shadowed corner of the past, where broken mirrors held secrets and every reflection bore a warning. We arrived at Wolfhurst Manor beneath a heavy sky, the wind sweeping low across the heath like a whispered lament. Though it was not yet dusk, the house presented a brooding silhouette against the horizon, its stone facade mottled with age, its gables crooked with time. A manservant awaited us at the entrance, and Lady Blackmore introduced him as Mr. Giles. He was of medium height, grey-haired but upright, with a manner that bordered on severe. He took our coats without expression and led us into a narrow vestibule that opened upon the great hall. I confess that the house affected me at once. There was a coldness to it, not of temperature alone, but of atmosphere. The walls were lined with portraits of solemn-faced ancestors, and in the dim light of the gas sconces, their eyes seemed to follow us with subtle disapproval. Sir Reginald kept largely to the west wing in his final weeks, Lady Eleanor explained as she led us to the study. He became increasingly withdrawn. Holmes made no reply, but took in his surroundings with quiet precision. He had entered that curious state of focused detachment I had seen so often before, a mind engaged at a level beneath the surface, absorbing and cataloguing with rapid efficiency. The door to the study was closed. Holmes paused before it, running his fingers along the outer edge of the frame. He pressed upon the latch and stepped inside. Even before I crossed the threshold, I felt a prickle of unease. There was something in the air, stale, expectant, as though the room itself had drawn breath but not yet released it. Holmes turned to us and said in a low voice, "Let no detail escape you, Watson. We are among shadows." The study into which we entered was a chamber of curious contradictions, tastefully appointed and yet somehow oppressive, as though the very furnishings resisted the intrusion of fresh air. Books lined the walls in towering mahogany shelves, and at the far end, beneath a tall mullioned window, stood an oak desk of considerable size. Just before it, upon a thick oriental rug, lay a bare space, a void where something important had once stood. "It was here," said Lady Eleanor softly. "The mirror was mounted above the fireplace, but Reginald had it removed days before that night." Holmes went at once to the fireplace, crouching to examine the hearth. The mantel was clean, but he drew a small glass from his pocket and peered along its underside. "Recently disturbed," he murmured. "See here, Watson, faint impressions where screws once held weight. And more curious still, a fine abrasion just below, as though something heavy were rested for but a moment." "Could the mirror have been returned?" I asked. "Perhaps, or feigned to be. The alignment does not match the bracket markings. This was not a haphazard breakage." Lady Eleanor moved to the side. "He was found here. His body lay across this rug, his hand closed around a piece of the mirror." Holmes examined the rug. "The fibres are disturbed. Someone knelt here, recently." He moved next to the window. "Latched from within, as you said. No sign of forced entry. Yet look here, a faint scuff on the inner sill, and below." He opened the window and pointed to the soft earth outside. Footprints leading away from the house, not toward it. Narrow, light tread. Not a man's boot, but neither quite a woman's. Possibly a servant. Possibly. He trailed off and turned to the fireplace again. With a flick of his hand, He retrieved a tiny object from the ashes. "A burnt match," he said, holding it up between thumb and forefinger, "and a curl of wax." He examined the area more closely. "There is a burn mark upon the carpet, not large but deliberate. Someone lit something here, not a fire, but perhaps a candle." He stood and turned to me. "Watson, I do not believe we are dealing with despair. We are dealing with theatre." Holmes turned his attention to a tray resting atop the desk. Upon it, wrapped in cloth and placed with a sort of grim reverence, was the mirror shard Lady Eleanor had described. Holmes unwrapped it with care, revealing a triangular piece of glass, jagged at the edges, one side glinting more brightly than the others. He drew it near the window and tilted it toward the light. "There," he said. "Do you see it, Watson? Along the lower arc, an etching." I squinted. At first, it appeared no more than a scuff, but under Holmes's magnifying lens, the faint curvature of a sigil emerged, like an ornate letter or a stylized emblem. It had no clear language, but it was too deliberate to be random. "Could it be part of a family crest?" I asked. "Not one I recognize," Holmes replied, "but it bears resemblance to certain esoteric marks I've seen among Venetian guilds. The glass itself is indeed Murano, 16th century, as Lady Eleanor said. Quite valuable, quite rare." He lifted the shard and turned it in his hand. "What is curious is not merely that Sir Reginald held it, but that he held this particular piece. Out of all that must have been shattered, why this one? Unless, of course, it was given to him." "You think it was placed?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "that this was never meant to be seen, which is precisely why it must be." He wrapped the shard again and placed it in his coat. "This mark is no message. It is a warning." It was Holmes who requested to speak with the household staff in turn, and Mr. Giles, the butler, was summoned first. He entered with quiet efficiency, standing erect with hands respectfully clasped before him. There was no tremor in her voice, nor any outward sign of agitation. Yet from the moment he opened his mouth, I sensed Holmes had fixed him with a particular interest. "You were the last to see Sir Reginald alive, I believe?" Holmes asked. "I brought his evening brandy and secured the study door behind me, sir. That would have been just after 9. "And you observed nothing unusual in his manner?" "He was contemplative, sir, silent, but not, if I may say so, despondent. I've seen the master in darker humours before." Holmes nodded. "And the mirror?" Mr. Giles blinked once. "Sir Reginald had it removed the Monday prior. I oversaw its relocation to the West Storage Gallery, per his instructions. Yet it was found shattered in the study." The butler's eyes remained steady. "That is what I was told, sir. I cannot speak to how it returned." Holmes studied him a moment longer. "You've served the family long?" 11 years, sir." "An admirable tenure. That is all for now." As Giles bowed and exited, Holmes turned toward me with a faint narrowing of his eyes. "Well," I whispered. Holmes offered only a thin smile. "A man may say little, Watson, and yet leave much unsaid." Our next conversation was with Miss Lillian Vexley, Sir Reginald's private secretary. She received us in the morning room with a quiet dignity, though there was a nervousness in her manner that did not escape Holmes's notice. "I understand you were responsible for cataloguing Sir Reginald's collection," Holmes began. "Yes," she replied. "Every acquisition was recorded, measured, and filed under his instruction. He was meticulous about his inventory." "And the Venetian mirror?" She hesitated, as if weighing the cost of her honesty. "It arrived 6 months ago from Milan. He paid an extraordinary sum for it. far beyond its appraised value. For its provenance. Number 2 for its mystery. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Mystery, Miss Vexley. She nodded. There was a legend attached to it, one Sir Reginald found both amusing and unsettling. Something about its having once belonged to a Venetian noble who died under suspicious circumstances. Local superstition held that the mirror was cursed, though Sir Reginald dismissed that as nonsense. And yet, he had it removed. Yes, a fortnight before his death, he asked me to ensure the item was listed for storage. He seemed different, distracted, curt. He hardly spoke to me at all during those final days. Holmes steepled his fingers. And who else had access to the gallery where it was stored? I cannot say. The staff, I suppose, but the gallery is rarely entered. Did you see Sir Reginald on the night of his death? She shook her head. Not after dinner. He retired early. I was in my quarters cataloguing invoices. When we left her, Holmes remained silent for several paces before murmuring, "There is knowledge she holds back, Watson. But whether from fear or guilt, I have yet to decide." Our final interview that day was with the gardener, a stooped and weather-worn fellow by the name of Crail. He spoke with a strong Yorkshire accent, which Holmes deciphered with characteristic ease. "It were near midnight," he said, "and I were finishing with the east beds. Had a lantern with me. Low light, but enough to see." "And what did you see?" Holmes asked. Crail scratched at his chin. "A figure, sir. Tall. Black coat, I reckon. Moving quiet, round the side of the house toward the study window." "Did the figure enter the house?" "No, sir. Leastways, I didn't see no such thing. Just passed out of view. Thought maybe it was Sir Reginald himself, but he walked strange, like he was sneaking." "Did you mention this to anyone?" Crail shifted uneasily. "Didn't seem right to speak ill of the dead, sir, and the constable said it was suicide, so I kept my mouth shut." Holmes made a note in his book. "The direction of movement, towards or away from the house?" "Away, sir, toward the copse behind the stables." Holmes closed his book. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Crail." As we walked back toward the house, I asked, "Do you credit his tale?" Holmes nodded absently. "It aligns with the footprints beneath the study window. But more than that, it introduces a question. Why would a man feign suicide and then leave by stealth?" By evening, my head swam with conflicting impressions. Each fragment of testimony had added weight, but not shape, to the puzzle before us. The mirror's reappearance, the etched sigil, the burn upon the hearth, all seemed significant in isolation and maddeningly disconnected when viewed as a whole. "I cannot see it," I confessed, as Holmes poured a measure of brandy in our guest chamber. "There is too much contradiction. Why would Sir Reginald remove a mirror only for it to return shattered in the room where he died? Why would a man stage his own suicide? And what of the sigil? A warning to whom?" Holmes, ever calm, swirled the liquid in his glass and regarded the fire. "There is a thread, Watson. It is faint, but present. I cannot grasp it, because it is not yet fully drawn." He rose and paced, hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Vexley is not telling us everything. Giles is too guarded for comfort. The gardener saw something, but what and whom remains uncertain. And all of it is cloaked by this mirror and the fear it inspired." He stopped and turned toward me. "We are not looking for what was broken, Watson. We are looking for what was hidden." It was a curious remark, but one I would come to understand all too clearly. The following morning found Holmes once more in the study, crouched before the fireplace with a metal tong in one hand and a look of intense focus upon his face. I had grown accustomed to his early risings and curious rituals, but on this occasion, his absorption surpassed even his usual fervour. "There is much to be learned from ashes, Watson," he said, as he sifted through the charred remains of what had once been correspondence, especially when the fire was not lit to warm the room. From the blackened remnants, he withdrew a small, singed corner of heavy cream paper, too fine for common correspondence. Upon its scorched edge was a symbol, partial but unmistakable. "There," Holmes whispered, handing it to me. "Compare it to the etching on the shard." I did so. The sigil, though incomplete, mirrored the arc and curve of the symbol etched into the glass. It was not a coincidence. "A match?" I asked. "Beyond doubt," Holmes replied. "Sir Reginald received this letter before his death. It was burned, perhaps by his own hand, or by another's. The symbol suggests its origin lies with the mirror itself, or those who once owned it." Could this be a warning? Possibly, Holmes mused, or a demand. The language of threats is often cloaked in mystery to make it more fearsome. I saw him glance toward the corridor, as though listening for the faintest sound. "Someone wished this letter to disappear," he said quietly, "but not before its mark had impressed itself upon the mind of its recipient. That mark may have returned days later, etched in glass, and in blood." He stood, slipping the fragment into his pocket. "There are too many secrets here, Watson. Let us now see what the village remembers of this mirror. The past often speaks loudest when the present refuses to answer." That afternoon, we took our inquiries beyond the manor walls, walking into the village that lay nestled at the foot of the moor. Holmes believed, with good reason, that the whispers of common folk often contain the husks of truth, however buried in superstition. At the apothecary's shop, a matronly woman named Mrs. Hathersley proved a surprisingly fruitful source. When Holmes inquired about Sir Reginald's Venetian mirror, she crossed herself and lowered her voice. "You mean the devil's eye," she whispered. "That cursed thing ought never to have come here." Holmes, ever patient, prompted gently. "You've heard of it before." "Indeed. My father was from Lancashire, but my mother was born near Venice. She'd heard stories as a child of a mirror that showed not your reflection, but your sins. They say it belonged to a nobleman who was murdered by his own brother after looking into it. Madness followed the mirror. Fires, suicides, always the same." "And what became of it?" She frowned. "It vanished, until your Sir Reginald brought it here." Another villager, an old cobbler named Finch, claimed the mirror had been cursed by monks in the 1500s to trap a demon's image. "Can't say as I believe it," he said, "but I wouldn't keep a Venetian relic in my sitting room." Holmes absorbed all without comment. As we walked back toward Wolfhurst, I could not help but shiver, not from the cold, but from the curious sense that the villagers' tales, though fanciful, circled some core of concealed truth. "You do not credit the stories, surely?" I asked. Holmes looked thoughtful. "Not the supernatural elements, no. But fear is a potent instrument, Watson, far more effective than the sharpest blade. Whoever sent that letter knew of the mirror's reputation. They employed it with purpose." He paused and turned his gaze toward the distant silhouette of Wolfhurst. "Superstition makes an excellent disguise for intention. I begin to suspect this case is not one of passion, but of design." Later that evening, while reviewing Sir Reginald's ledgers and personal correspondences, Holmes paused over a folded letter that bore neither seal nor formal heading. It had been tucked within the pages of a catalogue, as though hidden intentionally. His eyes scanned the contents with growing interest. "Well, well," he murmured. Here is a name I had hoped to find. He handed the letter to me. It was brief, but unmistakable in tone. The writer had pressed Sir Reginald to relinquish the Venetian mirror before further consequences befell. It was signed simply, M. Sir. Melrose? I asked. Undoubtedly. Professor Horace Melrose, collector, scholar, and Sir Reginald's bitterest rival. They once competed for the same Spanish crucifix at a Sotheby's auction and have despised one another ever since. Do you suppose Miss Vexley knew of this letter? Holmes was already nodding. More than that, she facilitated it. He requested her presence, and though she entered with composure, Holmes noted her tightened jaw. Miss Vexley, he began. You told me Sir Reginald was increasingly withdrawn in his final days, but I suspect it was not solitude he sought, it was secrecy. She said nothing. Holmes continued. You were in communication with Professor Melrose. Did he ask you to persuade Sir Reginald to part with the mirror? Her voice was quiet. He offered to buy it. Sir Reginald refused. Did you share this offer? I did, she admitted. But I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I never thought. He never threatened violence. I merely believed the mirror had become unhealthy for Sir Reginald. I thought removing it would help. Holmes regarded her a long moment. Unhealthy for the mind, or dangerous to the conscience? She did not reply. After she departed, Holmes turned to me with grim satisfaction. Melrose is a man of means, but not of subtlety. He would never have etched a symbol or staged a suicide, but he might well have pushed another to act. A pawn? I asked. Perhaps, Holmes said, or a shadow working under cover of another's ambition. We returned to the Manor late in the evening, the air thick with impending rain and something heavier still, suspicion. Holmes requested privacy in Lady Eleanor's sitting room, ostensibly to examine her late husband's books of antiquities, which she had stored there after his death. She granted him access without hesitation. It was there, beneath a small stack of correspondence on the escritoire, that Holmes retrieved a torn envelope, its flap half ripped, the contents partially visible. He examined it silently, then handed it to me with the faintest furrow to his brow. The paper was crisp, the ink still fresh. It was an excerpt from a solicitor's formal letter, clearly outlining the terms of Sir Reginald's most recent amendment to his will. A clause had been added just weeks before his death. In the event of his passing without an heir, the entirety of his estate, including the collection, would pass directly and unconditionally to Lady Eleanor. I confess a chill passed through me at the sight of it. She never mentioned this, I said low. In fact, she appeared altogether ignorant of any change in his will. Not ignorant, Holmes murmured, but silent. We found Lady Eleanor seated alone in the drawing room, her expression composed, though her hands trembled faintly in her lap. Holmes, without preamble, handed her the document. I had hoped this would not surface, she said after a long silence. But I suppose it was inevitable. Why conceal it? Holmes asked. Surely you knew its significance. Because I knew how it would appear, that I stood to gain, that I might have... She faltered. Reginald never told me he'd amended the will. I discovered it myself in his desk drawer, the day after he died, and yet you remained silent. I loved him, Mr. Holmes, and I feared that speaking the truth would taint his memory. Holmes studied her carefully, but said nothing. When she withdrew to her chambers, I turned to him. Do you believe her? He paused, then said simply, I believe she speaks the truth, though not the whole of it. And with that cryptic remark, he turned once more toward the corridor, leaving the torn letter in my hand, as if it weighed far more than parchment should. That night, I found myself staring into the hearth, unsettled in mind and spirit. The revelations of the day had grown more tangled than I could clearly recall in any case we had yet encountered. And through it all, the figure of Lady Eleanor hovered like a ghost at the centre of the storm. "She seems genuine," I muttered, more to myself than to Holmes. "Her grief, her shock, even her silence, I cannot reconcile them with malice." Holmes, across from me, was polishing his lens with deliberate slowness. "Emotion, Watson, while often sincere, is a poor compass in a storm of motives. But the inheritance clause, the secrecy, it speaks against her. Only if we accept it as motive rather than misdirection." I frowned. "And what of Miss Vexley, Melrose, Giles? You cannot suspect them all." Holmes gave a soft chuckle. "On the contrary, I suspect no one yet. Suspicion must be earned, not assumed." I rose and paced the room, unsettled. "We have a mirror returned without explanation, a symbol etched with intent, a body found in apparent solitude, a figure seen at midnight, a forged letter, a missing shard, and a great deal of fear," Holmes added softly. "That is the thread you miss, Watson. Fear is the common denominator. The mirror inspired it. The sigil invoked it. The actions of every person in this house have been shaped by it." "And Lady Eleanor?" Holmes looked at me for a long moment. "She is afraid, but not, I think, of guilt." I sank into my chair, still uncertain. I trusted Holmes as I trusted no other man, but even I could not deny that the walls of Wolfhurst pressed more tightly around us with each passing hour. The following morning, I found Holmes already in the West Gallery, the mirror storage room Lady Eleanor had mentioned. Dust clung thickly to the wooden floorboards, save for a set of tracks that led from the door to a tall, sheet-draped object propped against the far wall. Holmes removed the sheet in one smooth motion, revealing the Venetian mirror in its entirety. Though cracked along one edge, it remained intact. A grand oval frame of gilded filigree surrounding glass that seemed darker than natural reflection should allow. He examined the glass, running his fingers along the edge, then tapped twice on the left frame. A hollow sound answered. "There's a cavity here," he muttered. With surgical precision, he drew a narrow blade from his pocket and gently pried at the decorative crest. A faint click sounded, and a portion of the frame gave way. Inside was a narrow compartment no broader than a book. Holmes reached in and removed a folded sheaf of parchment bound with red twine. "Hidden within the frame itself," he said. "Clever." We examined the documents together. They were written in Sir Reginald's hand. Notes, translations, and, most curiously, a transcription of a letter from Venice. It referenced not only the mirror's previous owners, but a particular theft involving forged provenance documents, an incident dating back over 20 years. "I remember this," Holmes said, eyes scanning the lines. "A theft in Florence. A museum director was quietly dismissed. The case was never made public." "And you think Sir Reginald uncovered it?" "No," Holmes replied. "I think he discovered something else, that someone in his own household had been involved." I looked at him, stunned. "You mean to say Reginald found these papers hidden in the mirror's frame? Someone else must have known. The mirror was not returned to the study by Reginald, but by the one who feared what he had uncovered. And the broken shard? Not grasped in desperation, but placed as a message, a warning, a claim." Holmes straightened, his gaze sharpening. "It was never about the mirror's curse, Watson. It was always about what it concealed." A soft knock at the gallery door interrupted our thoughts. A servant appeared, pale and breathless. "Beg pardon, sir," he said. "Mr. Giles has asked that you come to the study. He says he has something important to confess." Holmes met my eyes, and I felt a chill pass through me. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "The trap has been baited, and now it springs." Later that day, with a gravity that immediately arrested the attention of all within Wolfhurst Manor, Holmes summoned the principal members of the household to the drawing-room. His tone bore no urgency, yet the undercurrent of finality in his manner was unmistakable. "I must inform you," he began, "that a second shard of the Venetian mirror has been discovered." At this, a hush fell over the room. Lady Eleanor raised a hand to her lips. Miss Vexley looked swiftly toward the butler. Giles, for his part, betrayed no reaction whatsoever. "This particular shard," Holmes continued, "was found lodged behind the wainscoting in the West Gallery. A curious hiding place, and yet perfectly consistent with the rest of this curious affair." "Was it Reginald's doing?" Lady Eleanor asked faintly. "Doubtful," Holmes replied, "for the shard bears something most peculiar, a symbol etched not by accident, but with deliberate intention, a mark that may well be the key to this entire mystery." "And you believe this symbol has meaning?" asked Miss Vexley. "I do. In fact, I believe it meant enough to someone that they would go to great lengths to ensure it was never seen." There was a stillness then, broken only by the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath Giles's boot. "I shall retire now," Holmes concluded. "But know this. I intend to present the shard to the constabulary in the morning. The symbol, once verified, may provide the final link between Sir Reginald's death and the identity of the person responsible." With that, he bowed slightly and withdrew, I following close behind. Once outside the chamber, I could no longer restrain my question. "Holmes, there was no second shard, was there?" He allowed himself the barest smile. "No, my dear Watson. But I rather think someone in that room now believes there is. And belief, in such cases, is often more potent than truth. Tonight, we wait, and when the house grows still, so shall they come." The moon had scarcely cleared the clouds when Holmes roused me from my half-slumber with a single word: "Now!" We moved in silence, descending the staircase with the care of two men treading upon glass. The drawing-room lay in darkness, save for the faint outline of the decoy shard Holmes had crafted, an ordinary sliver of glass etched crudely with a replica of the symbol we had found. It rested on the desk, lit faintly by the dying embers of the fire. Holmes stationed himself behind the curtains, and I crouched behind the high-backed armchair, heart pounding in my ears. Minutes passed. Then footsteps, soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. The door creaked open. A figure slipped into the room with practiced care. By the faint light, I could see the shape of a woman, slender, cloaked, cautious. She moved straight to the desk, eyes fixed on the shard. As her hand reached out, Holmes stepped forward, switching on the lamp with a click that sent her recoiling. "Miss Vexley," he said evenly, "how kind of you to join us." She froze, hand still half raised. Her eyes darted to me, then back to Holmes. She began. "I only came to protect the household. I feared the item might be dangerous." "Indeed," said Holmes, taking the shard from her trembling fingers. "You feared it might incriminate you." She flinched. "I didn't kill him." Holmes's voice softened. "Then tell us what you did do." She sank into the chair behind her. "The letters. I forged them. I wanted him to give up the mirror, to sell it to Melrose. Reginald had become obsessed. The mirror frightened him, and frightened me." I thought if I scared him, he might let it go. You never intended harm, Holmes said gently. But you feared discovery. She nodded. I saw the symbol on the shard and thought, if the others saw it too. Holmes pocketed the false shard. You have confirmed what I suspected. But rest assured, Miss Vexley, you are not the one I was waiting for tonight. Miss Vexley remained seated in the drawing room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The veil of secrecy that had so long guarded her poise had now lifted, and in its place sat a woman overcome not by guilt alone, but by relief. Holmes, ever calm in the face of confession, regarded her with that same mixture of detachment and understanding that often disarmed the most unwilling of witnesses. You say you forged the letters, he repeated. May I ask what prompted you to such lengths? I had worked with Sir Reginald for over 5 years, she began, her voice brittle but steady. I respected him. But after the mirror arrived, something changed. He became withdrawn, erratic. He would sit for hours in the study, staring at that awful thing as though expecting it to speak. I feared for his mind. And so you sought to remove the cause? She nodded. I contacted Professor Melrose. He had been furious when Sir Reginald outbid him. He offered a substantial sum for the mirror. I thought, if I could frighten Reginald, make him believe the mirror was cursed, he might part with it. I never meant him harm. Holmes interjected gently. And the sigil on the shard? Was that your doing? Number I didn't even know about it until after he died. When I saw it, when I realized others might trace it back to the letters, I panicked. You attempted to recover the shard to destroy the link, Holmes said simply. She nodded again, tears glinting in her eyes. You've been reckless, he said, but not murderous. Rest assured, Miss Vexley, you will not be charged with Sir Reginald's death. At this, she looked up sharply. Then you know who... Holmes rose. I do. And without another word, he turned and walked into the corridor where, I knew, a far darker confrontation awaited. The household was gathered in the study at Holmes's request. Lady Eleanor seated near the hearth, Miss Vexley pale and silent in the corner, Mr. Giles standing rigid by the door, his expression unreadable. Holmes stepped forward and addressed us all with the calm authority I had seen him summon in countless drawing rooms, courtrooms, and scenes of unimaginable disorder. We now arrive at the final act of this affair, he said. What began as the apparent suicide of a man tormented by a cursed mirror has revealed itself as something far more human and far more deliberate. He held up the parchment we had discovered in the mirror's frame. Sir Reginald had, it seems, stumbled upon a cache of documents concealed within the mirror itself. Documents which, I have no doubt, he intended to bring forward. But there was someone who could not allow that to happen. His gaze turned to Mr. Giles. Reginald trusted you. He instructed you to remove the mirror, and in so doing you learned what it concealed. Giles said nothing, but I noted the faint tightening of his jaw. You were once a forger in Florence, operating under a different name. The scandal was hushed, the records quietly buried, but you disappeared, only to resurface here, in the service of a man who, by fate or folly, had acquired the one object that could unmask you. Still no reply. You confronted him, Holmes continued, perhaps intending only to retrieve the documents, but he resisted, and so you killed him. Lady Eleanor gave a sharp gasp. You staged the scene, placed the shard, etched the sigil, knowing the legend would draw attention away from you. The mirror's legend was your shield. Giles remained frozen. I found the wax remnants in the hearth, Holmes said softly. You lit a candle, not to see but to cast shadow. It was theatre, Mr. Giles. But your performance ends here. There was silence. Then, at last, Giles spoke. He would have destroyed everything I rebuilt. I had no choice. You always have a choice, Holmes said coldly. And now you must answer for the one you made. Later that evening, as we sat once more by the fire in the drawing room, Holmes with his pipe, I with a tumbler of brandy, he began to lay out the threads of the case, weaving them together with the precision of a master craftsman. You see, Watson, he said, the suicide theory unravelled the moment we examined the position of the body and the state of the mirror. No man, however distraught, smashes a relic he previously removed to storage, only to shatter it dramatically and etch a cryptic symbol in glass. The scene was constructed, and rather poorly at that. The shard? I asked. Placed post-mortem. The shape was too clean, the etching too precise. It was not torn from violence, but chosen with care. Giles meant for us to believe the symbol was the dying act of a tormented man. In truth, it was the mark of a frightened one, a desperate attempt to point attention away from himself and toward the legend. Holmes rose and began to pace. Everything hinged on that mirror, Watson. The moment Sir Reginald discovered the hidden compartment, whether by curiosity or by accident, he signed his own death warrant. Giles had lived a quiet, comfortable life for over a decade under a false name. Exposure meant ruin. And so he struck, I said. Indeed, he used the very object of discovery, the mirror, to stage a tragedy steeped in superstition, a sigil tied to Venetian law, a curse whispered through the village, a dramatic pose of death, all to shroud the truth beneath theatrics. He paused by the fire, gazing into its glow. Fear, Watson, is the most pliable of instruments. It makes men blind, it makes them silent, and in this case, it nearly made them complicit. I said nothing, humbled by the clarity of his analysis. Holmes turned at last. Suicide was never a question. The only question, he said, was who stood to lose most from the truth. Legends, Watson, Holmes continued, have a peculiar potency, not because they are true, but because they are believed. He took a slow draw on his pipe, the smoke curling like ancient myth itself. Sir Reginald's mirror carried with it the stain of centuries. A nobleman slain by his brother, a demon's image trapped in glass, madness, fire, all the makings of a satisfying fireside tale. But in our present case, the legend served a modern purpose. To frighten Sir Reginald? I asked. To frighten everyone, Holmes corrected. The mirror's story was exploited by more than one player. Miss Vexley believed the tale just enough to wield it as leverage. She forged the letters in the hope of provoking fear, not violence. And Giles used the tale to mask a calculated murder with the veil of the arcane. It seems monstrous, I muttered, that a myth could be employed with such effect. Holmes nodded. And yet that is precisely what made it so effective. It removed the need for logic. It excused contradictions. Why question a missing shard, or a burn on the rug, or a mirror mysteriously restored, when the spectre of a curse hovers over the scene? Superstition, my dear fellow, is the enemy of inquiry. He rose and moved to the desk, where the now shattered frame of the Venetian mirror rested. There never was a curse, only a mirror, only a man with something to hide, and another who tried too hard to see. I followed his gaze, and for a moment, the glass seemed to hold not reflections, but secrets, long buried, now exposed. And Miss Vexley? I asked. What becomes of her? Holmes looked thoughtful. She has committed no crime that Scotland Yard will pursue. The forged letters, though deceptive, caused no death. And now that her motives are known, I believe she has suffered enough. She seemed sincere, I said. And ashamed. She was both, Holmes replied. Her guilt was not of murder, but of manipulation. She feared Sir Reginald's obsession and believed herself justified in employing fear as a corrective. But fear, as we have seen, is a tool no one holds safely. He turned toward the hallway. I believe she will leave Wolfhurst in the morning. Her tenure here has ended, though not perhaps her penance. I nodded slowly. And Lady Eleanor? She is a woman of strength, Holmes said quietly. She bore suspicion with dignity, even when the shadows crept too close. Her silence over the will's amendment was not cowardice, but sacrifice. She feared her truth would cast doubt rather than clarity. We sat in silence for a time. Then Holmes added, almost to himself, "It is the great tragedy of such cases that innocence must so often walk alongside suspicion, and virtue must stand trial for the sins of others." I studied him, that strange, singular man whose genius saw through fog what others could not in light. "And you, Holmes," I asked, "what do you see in the mirror?" He turned, and for a moment, the glint of firelight caught his eyes. "Nothing," he said softly. "And that, Watson, is precisely why I trust it." In the wake of Giles's confession, the household had fallen into a kind of hushed disbelief. Lady Eleanor, though outwardly composed, remained pale and silent. Holmes, however, seemed more reflective than triumphant, and I soon discovered why. "It is worth noting, Watson," he said, as we walked the long corridor outside the study, "that Lady Eleanor's inheritance played no true part in the crime itself, yet it nearly misled us entirely." "The clause in the will," I said. "It cast suspicion upon her at the moment it mattered most." "Precisely," Holmes nodded. "And what makes the deception so insidious is that she herself did nothing to raise that suspicion. She neither encouraged nor benefited from it in any deliberate way." "But Giles must have known," I said. "He had access to the will. And he used that knowledge artfully," Holmes replied. "He allowed the clause to remain hidden, knowing it would surface naturally once the investigation took its course. He trusted that our minds, like those of any reasonable observers, would leap to the wrong conclusion." "A diversion by omission," I murmured. "Indeed. The most elegant kind." Holmes stopped and turned to me. "Never forget, Watson, that the cleverest criminals are those who do not act, but wait. Giles needed only to let suspicion fall where it would naturally settle, on grief, on gain, on the silence of a widow, and in doing so, he gave himself time." Holmes nodded once. "Time enough to burn the letter, hide the documents, and destroy the only witness to his past." He said nothing more, but I could not help glancing back toward the darkened study door. The image of the mirror returned to my mind, not for its legend, but for what it had concealed. In this house, I realized, truth had long been framed and hidden, like glass behind gold. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street 3 days later. The case concluded, the matter handed to the appropriate authorities. Yet in his habitual fashion, Holmes took no particular pride in the resolution. "The mirror," he said, seated once more in his armchair, "was no more cursed than your medical bag, Watson, but it was dangerous, for it held something far more volatile than superstition, a secret. A secret that cost a man his life," I replied. "More than one," Holmes murmured. "Giles had long since murdered the life he once lived. When he took that new name and entered Wolfhurst Manor, he became something other than a butler. He became a fiction. Reginald's discovery threatened to expose the illusion, and so Giles destroyed the evidence." You believe he had knowledge of the documents all along? No, said Holmes. I believe he suspected. But the truth, the full truth, came to him only when Sir Reginald opened the frame. That single moment, Watson, changed everything. Giles was not a cold-blooded killer by nature, but he had spent years building a life upon falsehood, and falsehood, when cornered, becomes desperate. He opened his desk drawer and removed the parchment recovered from the mirror's hollow, now sealed in an envelope for delivery to the Yard. These documents, Holmes continued, detailed not only the forgery, but implicated others in the original scandal. Reginald had no intention of blackmail, of that I am certain, but the mere existence of the truth was too great a threat. And the sigil. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. An old Venetian seal, traced from the same ink Giles had once used. A signature to frighten others, and to remind himself who he once was. A signature of guilt. We fell into silence. Then Holmes added almost idly, "Curious, is it not, that the most damning truths are the ones we try hardest to bury, not because they are false, but because they are ours." He leaned back in his chair, gaze distant. In the end, it was not the mirror that condemned Giles. It was the reflection he feared it might one day show. The case of the shattered mirror left me with an unease I could not readily shake. It was not, as with other of our adventures, the violence or the cunning that haunted me. It was the idea that beneath the surface of refinement and civility, there had dwelled a secret so poisonous it had altered the course of lives. Giles had served with unerring precision. His manners were exact, his loyalty seemingly unimpeachable. And yet, at his core, he had lived in constant dread, not of punishment, but of exposure. Miss Vexley, too, had acted not out of malice, but out of a fear she did not fully understand. Her deception had been born of dread, not greed. Even Lady Eleanor, with all her composure, had concealed truths to protect the memory of a man she loved. There was, it seemed to me, a kind of rot that crept silently through lives built on appearances. Not the grand evil of overt villainy, but the quiet corruption of concealment. As I sat opposite Holmes, the fire casting long shadows upon the walls, I found myself asking, "Do you suppose, Holmes, that any of us would survive the scrutiny of such a mirror?" He did not answer immediately. Then, without looking at me, he said, "There is no mirror in the world, Watson, that shows a man what he fears most, save the one he must carry in his conscience." And with that, he resumed his reading, as though the case were closed and the world once again at peace. But I, staring into the flames, could not help but wonder just how many mirrors remained. Unbroken, unexamined, and utterly silent. As the last embers of the fire faded to ash, and the case of the shattered mirror retreated into the quiet corners of memory, I turned to Holmes, who sat in thoughtful repose, his gaze distant yet sharp. "You never truly believed in the curse," I said, watching the play of shadows on his face. "Of course not, Watson," Holmes replied. "Men may cloak their sins in superstition, but mirrors, real or imagined, only reflect what is already there." He tapped the stem of his pipe against the armrest. Giles feared the truth, not because it would convict him, but because it would reveal him. In the end, it was not the documents that destroyed him. It was the knowledge that someone, somewhere, might one day look too closely. There was a pause before he added more softly, "A man may live behind polished glass, Watson, but it is his conscience that reveals the cracks." Holmes believed Giles's undoing was inevitable the moment he tried to disguise guilt as myth. But what do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? Was it the forged sigil, the return of the mirror, or something far more human? We'd love to hear your deduction. Share your theories in the comments below. And if this tale intrigued your inner detective, do subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries, deduced from the shadows and brought to light. And don't forget to share this case with a fellow mystery lover. After all, every brilliant deduction begins with a single shared clue. Until the next case, dear reader, keep your eyes sharp and your conscience clear.